Well, good morning, class. Welcome back to Life of Christ, and we're going to jump right in. Whoops, missed the click. We're gonna jump right into it this morning by focusing on our class, the plot to execute. You'll remember we are sort of plugging away. excuse me, looking at Holy Week. Today we come to Wednesday of Holy Week, and this is the day of the plot. And really, I think I mentioned this in our last class. After Tuesday's antics, a tipping point was reached. If it wasn't enough for Jesus to announce himself as king on Sunday, then condemn the temple on Monday, then Tuesday basically rebuff the religious leaders, by Tuesday afternoon, when he is essentially standing as a prophet and saying that the temple is going to come down, and with it, of course, the entire Old Covenant system and the religious leaders, they have had enough. And so Wednesday, at least with respect to sort of Jesus, is relatively quiet. But behind the scenes, under the cloak of darkness, the machinations of the religious leaders are hard at work. And what they are doing is plotting to execute Jesus. So to look at this, we're going to real briefly sort of look at this plot and look at sort of the themes, the who, where, what, when, and why. And I'm going to skate through this pretty quickly because I'm going to give you some scripture references and you've done your own reading. And so when we're talking about the who, it's important that, if you look at Matthew 26, verse 3, who is doing this plotting? We're told it's the chief priests and the elders. That's Matthew 26, 3. If you look at Luke 14:1, that's not true. Mark 14:1, excuse me, and Luke 22:2, you find it's the language of the chief priests and the scribes. And so if you sort of coalesce all of this, what you have is the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. They're the ones who are involved in this plot. And really, when you have in the New Testament, at least the Gospels anyway, when you have these groups, chief priests, elders, and scribes, this is another way of essentially speaking of the Sanhedrin. These are groups, these are players, both political and religious, that make up the Sanhedrin. We equated them earlier in our course to essentially in an analogous way, the Supreme Court of our land. This was sort of the highest court of appeals. And so, yeah, this is them. This is who is behind this whole thing. Let's shift gears very quickly to the where. Where does this happen? Matthew 26:3 tells us where they're plotting. It is at the palace of the high priest. That's what Matthew 26:3 tells us. They plotted this in the palace of the high priest. And the high priest here is Caiaphas. So we're talking about Caiaphas's palace. Just as a side note, some of your Bibles might have a footnote. Caiaphas's palace here is most likely referring to his private residence. So again, they're doing all of this under the sort of the cloak of darkness, right? The doors are locked, the shades are drawn. This is all sort of very sort of like that, right? Whispering and that sort of deal. What is the plot? And again, here, it's more than clear. You can look at Matthew 26:4, you can look at Mark 14:1, and you can look at Luke 22:2. All of them are more than clear that what the Jewish leaders are plotting to do, and this is some of the language, they are plotting to destroy Jesus. To destroy Jesus. So make no mistake about it, the plot is to murder, to execute Jesus. And it's worth pointing out, just as an aside, that in all three of the synoptics anyway, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when this is expressed, it is all either explicitly said or implied to be done by stealth, right? This is all, again, very, very hush-hush. When are they going to do this? When do they want to carry out this sinister plan? Well, this is, again, Matthew 26:5. Mark 14:2, Luke 22:2 again. Their intention is to carry this out after the feast. Now, I mentioned this when we began Holy Week. Remember, this is one of the 3 required feasts that all able-bodied male Jews are required to attend per the law of God, which means that, during Holy Week, Jerusalem was packed. It was packed with tourists / worshipers. And the reason this is important, because every year when this would happen, you have to remember that Jerusalem is under Roman occupation. And so, when you're Rome and you've already got something of a tumultuous, rebellious city, which is what Jerusalem is, and all of a sudden, the population quadruples or something like that, and it's probably more than that, honestly. When you have 10 times the amount of people all packing into this city for a religious festival, and one of the things that kind of marks out the Jewish people is that they celebrate the deliverance from a foreign oppressor, i.e. Pharaoh, and all of a sudden you are Rome and you are the oppressor at this point. Everybody getting together, you're on high alert. We might say, or we might hear in our military today, stay frosty, right? That's sort of that's the temperament of Rome at this point. Rome is on high alert. And so I say all of that to say this: the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, as they are plotting the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, they recognize, as we've seen, particularly in our reading throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus of Nazareth is something of a celebrity. Now, the reason for him being a celebrity might not always be honorable. In other words, it's not as if Jesus has thousands and thousands and thousands of people flocking around him because they believe him to be the Christ or something like that. It would seem that most of the people are flocking around Jesus because they want to see a trick. They want to see a miracle. They want a free lunch, right? They sort of want the benefits. They want the gifts. They don't want the giver, so to speak. Or if they do, they want the giver on their terms. But the point is, there's a lot of people that are like fans of Jesus, right? He's got a lot of Facebook followers. And so you just going off him in already sort of a tense situation. And what the Sanhedrin fears is that if they do that, then there's going to be a revolt. And if there is a revolt during an already tumultuous time where people are already packed in Jerusalem like sardines, the Romans have a pretty effective way of handling these types of riots and revolts. And Rome would just come in with their swords and their shields and mow everybody down. That's exactly what they would do. And so again, what the timing of this is because the Sanhedrin wants to bring down judgment upon Jesus. They don't want to bring down the judgment of the Romans upon their own heads. Hope that makes sense. Okay, and then lastly, just why? Why is the Sanhedrin, why is Wednesday for the Sanhedrin a day of plotting to execute? And the short answer is because Jesus of Nazareth challenged everything they stood for. From their power to their prestige to their popularity, the religious leaders have been threatened by Jesus on every front. And they interpret this as a crime, in fact, capital crime. And so therefore, for this great crime of Jesus, he must be killed. Let's conclude our time this morning by just making sort of something of an application, sort of rise above this, look at it from 30,000 feet. And that is, when you're looking at Wednesday and you're looking again at Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 22, we want to make note of what I'm just going to call the appearance of control. So from the Jewish leaders' perspective, they think that they themselves are in control. They think that they're calling the shots. They're plotting. They're deciding who's going to die. They're deciding when they're going to do it. They're deciding how they're going to, right? They're the ones that are sort of the puppet masters, right? They're the ones pulling the strings and making this whole thing happen. But that's just their perspective. That's not true. That's not true at all. I might think that gravity isn't a big deal, but if I jump off of a building, I'm going to find out real quick that I'm going to land on the ground. It's as if the religious leaders think that they can jump off of a building, and because they don't think gravity is real, that they won't fall. From the triune God's perspective, there's something else going on, and that is that he is ultimately in control. in and through the evil will of the Sanhedrin people, God is actually working out his good, eternal will through them. Now, this is the doctrine of God's sovereignty in systematic theology, and more to the point, the doctrine of concurrence. And that is to say that God works his will through the will of people, so that ultimately it is the will of God that is accomplished. And what we have before us with this plot to execute Jesus is, well, for all intents and purposes, the greatest evil that has ever been committed on the face of the planet Earth. I mean, they are, the religious leaders, they are plotting the unlawful and unjust execution of quite literally the sinless Son of God. There is no greater evil that has ever been committed than the death of God's Son. And yet, what we know is that it is actually God himself who is orchestrating all of these events. So I'm going to give you a couple of passages to look up. Isaiah 46, 8 through 11. Isaiah 46, 8 through 11. We see this emphasis upon God's will and God's purpose and God accomplishing his purpose. God is in control. Isaiah 46, 8 through 11. Or Psalm 115, verse 3, where we are told that God is in the heavens and he does whatever he pleases, whether in heaven above or on the earth beneath. God does what he pleases. And then of course, thinking of the doctrine of concurrence, we might think of Genesis 50, verse 20, where Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. And at the end of that whole story, what does Joseph confess except this? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Notice it does not say, what you meant for evil, God turned into good. The same verb is used in the Hebrew. You meant, that's the verb, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. So it's one event and two purposes, two wills. There's the human and then there's the divine. The human meant is evil. The human will, the human purpose is evil. But it is God in that same event who actually has a good purpose and a good will. God meant it for good. To further reflect upon this, I would direct your attention to Acts chapter 2, verse 23, Acts 2:23, and Acts 4:23 through 28. Acts 2:23 and Acts 4:23 through 28. And what you see, according to the apostles, is that the evil of the Jewish leaders here that we're reading about right now on Holy Week is actually them doing exactly what God had ordained. And the reason is because it is God who is in control. Whoops. Sorry about that. It is God who is in control. Isaiah 53:10, it pleased the Lord to crush him. Let us not think for a moment that the crucifixion of Christ was an accident or plan B or something that caught God off guard. This was God's plan from before eternity, right? From before creation, from eternity past, God had determined to redeem for himself a people from every tribe and tongue and nation and language by the death of his Son. Let us rejoice in such things. Until next time.